Alright, welcome back to my final full episode that I will make on this channel before I move out to college. This little project that I've been working on for about a month, month and a half, going on 2 months probably, is coming to an end. I move out in 3 days and a handful of hours, but who's counting? Who's counting? Not me, not me. And I'll probably post another video explaining what this channel was and why I did it, like night of, but this will be the last full episode that I post. Now, it really made a lot of interesting content for me, at least to research, when I did the Belgian photograph a couple weeks ago, where it was the soldiers standing in the beach line, and there was no information online about who they were, when it was, or anything like that. And I really wanted to do another thing like that. So in today's episode, we are going to follow that trend, and we're going to look at another photo. Now, this photograph in my tiny but humble collection shows a soldier standing in the front of a trench line looking at something, and the caption is "Camouflage Trenches in the Chemin Dames sector." And that is a very somewhat close pronunciation as far as I can tell. Take that with a grain of salt though. But when looking online, the only extra information that I could find that was not on the card that I just showed you was that it was a lieutenant in the Allied armies. Nothing more. And I looked forever. And I only found that caption on an Australian website. Why the Australians had it, I don't know. But whatever, it doesn't matter. So knowing, the location of it can really narrow down what's happening in the image. If you are given a date but nothing else, it's a little bit harder because then you have to comb through like 400 miles of area trying to figure out where the photograph was taken. But if you are given a location instead of a date, but all you have is a location, it is a lot easier to figure out who's in the photo, when the photo was taken, and a handful of other things. So this photograph was a perfect candidate for this little research project. Now, when you are looking up photographs like this, trying to figure out who this is, when this was, you have to look at the history of it. So knowing that this is in that sector, we can look at the history of it and figure out who was in that sector and who was not in that sector. And once we figure out who was and who wasn't in the sector, we can narrow it down to a very few select countries. And then you cross-reference that with the outfits that they're wearing, cross-reference that with the equipment and the building that's in the photograph, and you get yourself a year. Then you go back to the uniform with the year, and then you can cross-reference that, and you should figure out who's in the photograph down to at least the nation. So that's what we're going to do today. It's going to be great. So you have 3 major battles that happen in the Chemin Dames sector. You have the first, second, and third battle of the Aisne. That is A-I-S-N-E, the S is silent. Now, you had the first battle of the Aisne, which happens because the Germans have overextended their little Schieffelin plan. With this expertly drawn drawing, we can see this. You have this big right hook of the Schieffelin plan. They have overextended. The French and British push in at the Battle of Marne in between the German armies. And then, after the Battle of the Marne, the Germans go into a full-fledged retreat on almost all fronts in the north as they try to consolidate their forces. And as they're retreating, they decide that they are going to make a consolidated stand during the first Battle of the Aisne, which is behind the Aisne River. Now, during this huge battle, you have the Germans, which secure the ridge of Chemin Dames, which translates to something about a lady, things like peace or something like that. It was kind of cool. But they decide that they're going to hold the ridge because that is a significantly good defensive posture. There are several battles in World War I that are fought exclusively over ridges just like this one, because the northern part of France is very flat. So whoever controls this ridge that may only be 100 feet up can see tens of miles in every single direction, and they can direct their artillery, they can hide their artillery, they can protect their troops better. Like, everybody wants the ridge, which is why we see the 3 battles for this ridge that we're going to talk about. You have the Battle of Messines, which is in Belgium. You have the Battle of Vimy Ridge. You have the Battle of Vauquois, which is over a ridge. Like, it's extremely important. So the Germans hold up on this ridge and they make their defense. And their main job is to hold the ridge, but they were also trying to kick the French and the British back across the Ain River. The French and the British come into this battle trying to kick the Germans at least behind the ridge, because they want the ridge as well. But the main goal is to just push the Germans as far back as possible. So this battle begins in September of 1914, and it ends in a tactical draw. You have the Germans, which retain control of the ridge, but the British and French have strongholds across the river. So neither side really wins the battle. It's just this huge bloodbath. But strategically, so in the long term, the Germans do end up winning the first battle because they keep control of that ridge. So for the next 3 years, you have the Germans firing down on the French positions because they control the ridge. They can do that. So you have 3 years worth of just a stalemate where there are more important battles that are supposed to be the breakthrough. And they don't really think of this sector as where they're going to get that breakthrough. So in 1916, you have the Somme, you have Verdun, you have Ypres, which are these huge battles, but it's kind of all silent. In 1917, though, you have the Second Battle of the Aisne, where both sides have been digging in for 3 years now. Both sides have gotten extremely good at digging in and refining these trenches. And the French, which have just been handed a pretty good draw at the Battle of Verdun, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties, and you have the absolute bloodbath of the Somme that happened previously, and you have all of these other battles that happened in 14, 15, and 16, decide that this second battle is where they're going to get their breakthrough. So they are going to prep with this huge artillery barrage, and they fire down on the ridge for 7 days straight, which really only gives the Germans time to respond, because the barrage was that long. Now, by the end of this barrage, the Germans have reinforced a fair bit, but also the barrage kind of doesn't do a whole lot. And this is because the Germans have switched over to a new method of defense, and this is the defense in depth doctrine. In the beginning of the war, you would have both sides putting most of their troops in this frontline trench, and then they would have some reserve troops in the second and third line trenches. And the thinking was, if we can just hold the frontline trench and we put all of our force in it, and they're not able to take it, we don't have to worry about it. But then as artillery barrages get bigger, you have underground mines, you have the loss of a first line for some reason, leading to the rapid collapse of the second and third lines. The Germans catch on to this and they say, okay, well instead, what if we put very few people in the front line and then put the majority of our people in the second and third lines instead? Now, this also leads to the loss of the front line happening a lot more commonly, but it also leads to an increased chance of getting a good counterattack and getting that front line back. And it works really, really well. Also in defense in depth, you see machine guns not only in the second and third line trenches, but in between the trenches. And you also have machine guns located in shell holes instead of pillboxes. So this gives a covering field of fire and a very low chance of being, taken out by an artillery shell, because the artilleries are aimed on that front line. But because you're not in the front line anymore, it doesn't hurt you. But the French don't really know this quite yet, so this massive artillery barrage kind of doesn't do a whole lot for the French. So the French get out of their trenches, they charge forward, they take the front line, and then they get slaughtered. Hopelessly slaughtered. Except over the next couple of days, with repeated French attacks, the French push the Germans all the way off the ridge. They completely take the ridge. So the French have won the Second Battle of the Aisne, except after they win the battle, because of Verdun and the Somme and St. Nivelle and all of these other huge French battles with hundreds and thousands of casualties going on millions of casualties, the French army starts a mutiny. And you have the huge French mutinies of 1917, which leads to the second highest amount of court-martials and executions during World War I. And this cripples the French entirely. So even though they win the second battle, they are completely out of action for the rest of 1917, going on to early 1918 as they try to quell the unrest inside of the army. And that is a whole other fascinating thing that you should totally look up. The French soldiers, for the most part, would accept and continue to defend their trenches all the way through the mutiny. They just flat out refused to go up over the top and attack on these like pointless, suicide attacks, which is kind of respectable, not gonna lie. Now, for the rest of 1917, the French are completely out of action. Not much else happens in that sector, nothing notable at least. And then in early 1918, around February, the United States finally starts putting people on the front lines. You have American troops that show up in June of 17. They continue to train in France for a couple of months, and the first units get put on trenches late 17 going into 18. So the first unit that shows up in this sector is the 28th Infantry Regiment, a subsection of the 1st Infantry Division. Now, this unit is put there for two reasons. The first one is that the French requested it because they needed manpower in that sector to free up manpower for other sectors. And two, the Americans wanted quiet sectors to put their troops in, that way they could gain experience before they get put in, some huge bloodbath. So the 28th shows up, and they're there for a month and a half, from February all the way to March. And in this month and a half, nothing happens. They see no major engagements. And that is the end of Americans in that sector for the most part. They do fight later on, but not really in this sector. It's, the sector next to it. So that's the end of the Americans in that sector. That's all. Now, in May of 1918, so a handful of months after the Americans leave, you have the Third Battle of the Aisne. And in this one, the Germans put a full force attack into taking back the ridge. This is part of the larger Kaiserslautern offensive, part of the larger German offensive that happened almost on the entirety of the Western Front in an attempt to gain as much land as humanly possible, because they knew that the Americans were coming in full force. American units have already started to show up, and once the Americans are there full force, the Germans will lose. Like, they know that this is a losing battle at this point, so they are going to take as much land as possible, so that way, when they lose, they can get a conditional surrender and say, we will give you this land back if you don't put as many sanctions on us. And we will give you this land back if you let us keep this piece of land. So that's the whole idea of this massive attack, is to just get as much land as possible, and maybe they can win the war. Who knows? So the Germans attack, and it is a huge German victory. They take the ridge in just this amazing fashion. You have some impossibly veteran units leading this attack. And then after they take the ridge, they say they're not done yet, and they just keep going on. And they go almost 40 miles in distance in some places. And they get back to the Marne, where they were turned back 4 years earlier, which sparks the Second Battle of the Marne, which ends in a German defeat. And it is after the Second Battle of the Marne that the Germans are in a continuous retreat almost all the way through November of 1918, when the war ends. And that's the history of the sector. Even as the Germans are retreating, not much fighting happens there that gets noted down. So, what did we learn from this? We learned the French have been there for 4 years. We learned that they fought only the Germans. We learned that there were British in small numbers, not enough to talk about, but small numbers. And we learned that the Americans were there for a month and a half. So we just went from having tens of countries down to it being British, French, or American. And now we know that there were major events happening in 14, 17, and 18. With this information, we write it down and we can figure out who this is in the image. It makes this a whole lot easier. So now we're going to look at what's happening in the image. So here's that image that I showed you, but this one is zoomed in for the viewer's pleasure. And we can see with this much better quality photo what this guy is wearing and what is happening. So based off this photograph, we can tell that this is definitely a trench that has been made for, a extended amount of time in mind. Like, you can see the guy is standing on some duck boards, which shows that they have learned about the mud and that the mud is really hard to walk on. So if we put this wooden plank below us, we can walk across it with a lot more ease. And you can see that they have camouflage netting too. And camouflage netting only really came around in 1915. You would see instances of it in 1914, but nothing crazy like this. In the background, you can see kind of a ridge that goes up. And I'm not entirely sure, but I'm almost certain that that is called a mole hill, which was a French design, kind of like a command post basically, hidden with camouflage netting. And you can see that there is a thicker gauge wire that is holding up the walls held back by gravel. They have OSHA certified retaining walls on this trench. And the sheer level of refinement between the duck boards and the molehill and the camouflage netting and the OSHA certified shoring walls indicates that they've been here for a good long time. And they have learned about trench warfare and how to keep it, somewhat tolerable and how to make it easier on the soldiers. So based off of this, we can say that this is most likely, a later war image, which narrows it down a significant amount. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is that weird metal thing on the bottom right of the image. And I zoomed it in for you here so you could see it. This backs up the idea that this image was taken later in the war, because this is a French Hotchkiss machine gun mount. It's a tripod mount that was only produced starting in 1916. You can see the little hand crank. You can see the wheel to adjust the positioning of the tripod mount, same as the one on the right. You can see it's the same seat with the same back pedals to dig into the ground easier. That is the same exact mount that you see in that photograph. Now, we know that this photograph cannot have been made before 1916 because this is when that tripod was made. But more importantly, this tripod mount was the main tripod mount given out to American soldiers when they came over to France to fight. When we came over, we didn't have our own machine guns that we could give out as a standard, weapon. So we would take the French machine guns, and this was the main one given out to soldiers. So now we know it's post 1916, but also we can start leaning towards this being an American soldier due to the mount. Now, this guy's hat is incredibly distinctive, wildly distinctive, and it is one of the main things that tells us who this guy could be. Now, every nation had headgear to some degree, and some nations, like France, had very distinctive headgear, and some nations, like the standard British and American soldier, kind of look alike. But American officers, British officers, and French officers have extremely distinctive headgear that you won't see across those three nations. Looking at our headgear, knowing who is in this sector, we can cross out this being a French officer. This hat is not a kepi, which is what French officers were assigned. It is not an Adrian helmet, which you would see some officers wearing depending on how close they were to the front and the conditions that they were in. And it is not a British soldier for those same reasons. British hats had some variations that looked somewhat like this hat, but not close enough to think that this would be that. But if you go look at American headgear and what Americans assign to their officers, you will see a hat that looks identical. This is a World War I M1910 officer's hat, which was assigned to all officers going to France. You can see the brim is the same kind of length and curve. It's got a chin strap just above it, a lighter colored, neck, and then a flat top with an emblem on the front. And if you zoom in on the emblem really closely, you can see that it has two outstretching wings, which is the American eagle on the hat. So now, just based off of the hat, we can say that this is an American officer, which narrows this down a significant amount. Because now we know that this is an American officer and the Americans were only there for a month and a half. So we just went from a 4-year war time span down to a month and a half time span of who this could possibly be. Stay with me now. Now, the next thing we're going to look at, knowing that this is an American, is any other markings this guy has. And looking at the markings he has, we can narrow it down quite a bit, but it also raises more questions than answers looking at this guy's outfit. The first thing we're going to look at is the guy's weird clover thing that's on his arm here. So this clover thing that's on his arm is the lieutenant ranking for an officer's overcoat in World War I. And you also have the second lieutenant ranking, which looks a lot similar, and I am not good enough yet to say whether or not it's a first or second lieutenant. I want to say it's a first lieutenant, but don't quote me on that, but it's definitely lieutenant, first or second, who knows. Now, the next thing is the 2 chevrons facing downwards on this guy's sleeve. And this image on the right here, you can see this guy also has 2 downward facing chevrons on his sleeve. Now, you would be tempted to think that this would be the rank of corporal, because it's 2 downward facing chevrons. And it got me in the beginning too. But in World War I, starting World War I, and it goes on for a good long while, you would get a single chevron for every 6 months on the front. So this guy having 2 chevrons means that he has been in active service near the front line for at least a year, because you get an individual chevron every 6 months. So this guy has between 1 year and 1.5 years of service overseas. Except, thinking about it, that kind of brings up some issues. Because if this photograph was taken in, let's say, the end of March 1918, a year earlier from that would be March of 1917. But Americans didn't show up until June of 1917. So we have a 3-month gap before this guy should have gotten that second chevron. So how did he get that? How does this man have that chevron? And there's a couple possibilities as to how this man could have gotten 2 chevrons in a 9-month time span. Now, there are 4 possibilities going on 5 as to how this guy could have gotten that chevron early. Now, the first one is going to be that this guy was part of the extremely small contingent of, people that were sent over to France as soon as we joined the war in April, or maybe the even smaller contingent of people that were going over to France before we joined the war to see what do we need, what works, what doesn't work, why did attacks fail, why did our defense work, 100 different things. But the odds of a very lowly first or second lieutenant being sent over in this contingent are extremely small, because this contingent was mainly dominated by diplomats and extremely high-ranking officers. So, not really the best explanation, but it would explain how he has that chevron 3 months early. Now, the second option is going to be that maybe this guy went back to those trenches and, was there right before the attacks in May. And that kind of makes sense. The Americans didn't really go too far out of the sector. It doesn't make, the most ridiculous idea out of this guy came back to the trenches and was there. And, had the photograph taken in May, and he's 3 weeks away from getting the chevron. He gets it sewn in because he had time off and just puts it in 3 weeks early. Not a crazy idea. Kind of weird, but not crazy. Now, to back up this idea, maybe this overseas time begins when they get on the boats to go to France. Because if it counts when they're going on the boats to France and this guy goes back to the trenches in May, that absolutely makes sense as to why he would have that chevron. Because overseas time counts in the boats. So that's a possibility. Now, the next possibility is kind of my favorite as an explanation, and that is this photograph was taken after October of 1918. The ridge was retaken during that time as the Germans, were on their continuous retreat backwards. And if you were a German soldier attacking the ridge, you are not going to stop and take this completely random rusted machine gun mount that doesn't work for your machine guns. You're going to leave it there because their orders were explicitly to keep going. They were going so fast that they reached, August 1914 levels of speed. So it doesn't make, the craziest idea that they just went past the machine gun. And then once we retook that area, the machine gun was still sitting there. There was an American officer. There's a photographer following as the Germans are on this huge retreat, and he snaps a photo. And that's how we get that photo. So maybe it's October of 1918, and that would easily explain how he has 2 chevrons, because that is in between the 12 and 18 month time span where he would have 2. So that's my personal favorite. Now, you could say that this photograph was taken, way after in 1918, but Americans were sent over to go occupy Germany once the war ended. They didn't really stay around random battlefields in France. I mean, you would see them in Paris and you would see them in port cities, but you really wouldn't see them chilling out in some trench that they were in months prior. So that could be an option. Now, the fourth option, which I also really, really like, is going to be that the photographer of the photo just didn't know where he was. Now, the Americans fighting after they left this sector were incredibly close. So it's not an implausible idea either to say that, this photographer is rolling around the trenches and he was just recently in the, Chemin des Dames sector, and he goes, okay, I'm going to go see the Americans over here. And he goes over there, he takes a photo of an American, and he goes, okay, well, I was in the, Chemin des Dames sector, let's call it that. But he wasn't. And now we have a photograph that's incorrectly labeled. I like that idea. I like that idea a lot. I think that could be what happened. If that's the case, who knows what unit that could be? Who knows? Now, the fifth option, and I don't like this option that much, is that this guy fought in some other war or intervention before World War I. You have the Spanish-American War in 1898. Maybe he fought in that. He seems a little young to have fought in that, and then World War I. Also, he is a possibly first or second lieutenant. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense how he would fight in the Spanish-American War and then age 20 plus years and still be a lieutenant. I don't like that idea. I really don't. I think that's kind of a stupid idea. But the other option is maybe he fought in one of the 7 or 8 interventions that happened between 1898 and 1918. And that's how he got the overseas stripe. Who knows? There's 100 different things. But my two favorite are going to be after the ridge was retaken in October of 1918, and the photographer had no freaking clue where he was. I think those are the two best explanations. Now, if you really want to go into it, and I really wanted to myself, I just really ran out of time here, I think there's a chance you could identify who this is down to the individual himself. He has very defined facial features. On his left arm, our left, his right, is almost an X, and I tried to match that with, infantry or machine guns or artillery. I couldn't make it out, but I think that you could figure out who this was, and I might try. Who knows? But either way, what did we learn from this photograph? We learned that this photograph is an American officer who's a lieutenant who has been over there for 12 to 18 months fighting in the sector, and the photographer might be an idiot. Who knows? But that's narrowed down from quite a bit from just officer in the, Chemin des Dames sector whenever. So, who knows? Pretty fascinating stuff, though, I will say. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching these, Mom and Dad, No Grandpa, everybody else. And I will see you guys in my outro video that I make the night before I leave.